How certain are you, really, that justice is always served? That evidence, that it tells the whole story. What if the things we depend on the most? Eyewitnesses, confessions, even forensic science. What if they can be wrong? Devastatingly wrong.
It's a really unsettling thought, isn't it?
It is. And today, we're looking deep into a powerful book that confronts exactly that. It explores the dark side of the justice system, wrongful convictions.
And it's not just isolated mistakes we're talking about.
No, the book really lays out these systemic failures that led to innocent people losing years, sometimes decades, of their lives behind bars, some even facing execution.
It's gut-wrenching to read about.
By unpacking the stories in this book, we want to see how this happens, how fragile the pursuit of truth can actually be.
This reminds me a bit of our Mindful Moments on our YouTube channel.
Ah, yeah, that's a good connection.
There, we use AI book analysis to kind of give you a shortcut to understanding complex topics, get you thinking critically.
And that's what we're aiming for here, too. Just, doing it live, diving into this material that really makes you stop and think. Our mission, really, is to understand how these failures happen and what they reveal about our justice system.
What's so powerful about this book is how it forces you to face this uncomfortable truth. The system designed to find truth can sometimes, it can actively create errors. Or just ignore them.
It's not always malice either, right?
Yeah.
The book suggests it's often just human processes, biases, snowballing out of control.
Exactly. That's a huge part of it.
Okay, let's dig into that. One of the most disturbing ways the book shows things going wrong is right at the very beginning. This dangerous power of a hunch, and how it leads to coerced confessions.
It's alarming how often it starts there. Just a gut feeling. A detective thinks, this is my guy. Maybe there's pressure to close a big case.
And suddenly that hunch, not the evidence, is driving everything.
Right. The investigation shifts. It becomes less about finding the truth and more about confirming that initial suspicion, making the evidence fit the theory.
The book's account of the Michelle Bosco murder in Norfolk, the Norfolk 4 case, is just a tragic, perfect example.
Absolutely. Police zeroed in on these innocent sailors based purely on hunches. They seemed to just push aside the initial physical evidence that didn't fit.
Like with Dan Williams? The book mentions his wife confirmed he was home, asleep. A solid alibi.
A rock-solid alibi. But the police, they were already convinced about the sailors, so they didn't just dismiss it. They interrogated him, suggested maybe he had amnesia, maybe he sleepwalked.
That's incredible. It must have been terrifying.
And the book details the interrogation tactics. Awful stuff. Sleep deprivation, lying about evidence.
Falsely claiming other suspects had already confessed.
Yes. Take Joe Dick. Described as quiet, easily overwhelmed. He broke after 6 hours? 6 hours of just relentless, abusive questioning.
6 hours. Just imagine that pressure. And Derek Tice, what happened with him?
Tice was lied to, flat out. They told him others were testifying against him. The book describes him feeling scared, alone, physically sick, completely trapped.
He just wanted it to end?
He said he just wanted out by hook or by crook. Made a false statement he later just deeply regretted, said he felt stupid for doing it.
And what's almost more shocking is how the police theories kept changing after they got these confessions, especially when DNA evidence came back and excluded these guys.
Oh, the book highlights the absurdity. Yeah. Suddenly it wasn't their DNA because maybe the killer wore a condom.
Yeah.
Or maybe he didn't ejaculate. Or maybe an accomplice left the DNA.
Just grasping at straws to make it fit.
All these shifting stories just to explain away the physical evidence that completely contradicted their hunches and the confessions they'd squeezed out. And remember, these men had no criminal records. None. Unlike the actual killer, Omar Ballard.
And Ballard, the real killer, was only identified by DNA, 20 months later?
20 months. And by then, the book points out 7 different sailors, current or former, had been jailed, all excluded by DNA. That first hunch led them so far down the wrong path.
It just shows how vulnerable the system is when that desire for a quick arrest or conviction of the first suspect overrides really following the evidence.
It's a critical flaw.
So flawed hunches are one starting point. But the book also shows what happens when the evidence itself is the problem. Flawed or misunderstood forensic science. We put so much faith in science in the courtroom.
And sometimes that faith is completely misplaced. The courtroom gives this air of certainty to methods that are actually shaky or sometimes just totally unproven.
Like the cases involving Dr. Stephen Hayne, the cadaver king.
And Dr. Michael West in Mississippi. They're really stark examples.
Dr. Hayne. Those autopsy numbers the book mentions seem impossible.
They likely were impossible. He claimed, up to 2,000 autopsies a year? The recommended maximum is around 250.
2,000 versus 250. How?
Well, Mississippi didn't have a state medical examiner system then, so counties relied on people like him. But yeah, the sheer volume alone should have been a massive red flag.
And Dr. Michael West, he was involved in bite mark analysis. The book really takes that technique apart.
Yes, in the murders of Courtney Smith and Christine Jackson, the book describes how West testified, claimed without a doubt that LaVon Brooks was the only person on Earth who could have left a bite mark on one victim.
Even though the body had been embalmed, wouldn't that change things?
Hugely. Embalming significantly alters tissue. West claims certainty anyway.
And didn't he initially exclude the person who actually did commit the murders, Justin Johnson?
He did. Based on dental molds. It was only after Brooks became the suspect that West took his mold and suddenly came up with this definitive match. The book stresses that claiming that kind of absolute certainty from a bite mark, well, that was considered questionable even back then.
And today, bite mark analysis is widely seen as junk science.
Crucially, yes. The book points this out clearly. Major scientific bodies, the National Academy of Sciences, the President's Council on Science and Technology, they've all said there's no scientific basis for saying this specific person made this bite mark, period.
Texas even recommended banning it in trials.
They did. Yet, as the book notes, it still pops up. That gap between science and the courtroom is terrifying.
The book touches on other questionable forensic methods too, doesn't it?
Yeah, like bloodstain pattern analysis. In the Joe Bryan case, the expert, Robert Thorman, his training was basically one 40-hour course.
Sure.
In a hotel.
Seriously?
Yep. And he testified there'd be a vast amount of blood spatter on the killer, but they found zero blood on Bryan or in his car. The defense pointed this out, but...
The testimony still carried weight. And then there's the William Arson case. Infamous.
That relied on incredibly outdated ideas, things the book literally calls folklore about how fires burn. It completely ignored actual scientific standards for arson investigation.
So the investigators were using these myths.
Pretty much. Things that sounded convincing but were later totally debunked. Experts who reviewed it later, Lentini, Byler, Hurst, they found absolutely no scientific basis to call it arson. None.
It really shows how letting flawed science or just testimony based on shaky foundations into a courtroom can have these permanent, devastating consequences.
Exactly. It's not just about bad experts. It's about a system that struggles to properly vet the science it uses to decide people's fates. How can lawyers and judges, mostly non-scientists, effectively gauge this stuff?
It's a huge question. Okay, so beyond bad science, the book also gets into the human factors. Unreliable witnesses, especially those with incentives, and authorities withholding evidence.
Witness testimony feels so powerful, right? A jury hears someone say, I saw him do it, and that's hard to ignore. But memory is fragile, it's suggestible, especially if the witness gets something out of testifying or if their initial view wasn't even clear.
And when evidence that could help the defense is hidden, well, that just breaks the whole idea of a fair trial.
Fundamentally.
The Savannah Soldiers case, the Stanley Jackson murder, seems like a prime example of both witness issues and suppressed evidence.
It really is. James White was the only eyewitness. The book says right after the shooting, he couldn't ID anyone, couldn't pick them out.
But later he became certain.
Weeks later, yeah. After seeing the defendants, the soldiers, at a court hearing, then his identification became definite.
And did the police know his initial ID was shaky?
The book reveals they did. The investigators themselves had doubts about his ability to make a good ID, but that crucial info, it wasn't given to the defense for 22 years.
22 years? That's staggering. Evidence questioning the main witness hidden for 2 decades.
Unbelievable. And the prosecution in that case, according to the book, pushed some really wild theories too.
Like what?
They tried this race card angle, suggesting one soldier hated black people, and this bizarre Dungeons and Dragons thrill-seeker motive.
With no actual evidence for either.
Zero factual basis mentioned in the book.
Yeah.
And the defense apparently had strong evidence contradicting it, showing no signs of racial bias.
And there was other evidence that was ignored or hidden. Critical stuff.
Absolutely. The soldiers had incredibly strong alibis, confirmed timing, routes, distances. Their room showed no racist materials. But the big one the book details is the Yamakra report.
What was that?
A local police report about activity in that neighborhood. It mentioned other people in the area threatening racial violence around that time, pointing to completely different potential suspects.
And the defense never saw it.
It was withheld. Its discovery, years later, was key to their exoneration after 26 years. The Georgia Supreme Court basically said not having it made their trial fundamentally unfair.
Just chilling. The book also talks about jailhouse informants, right? Snitches?
Yes, another huge problem area. The Todd Willingham case, again. A jailhouse snitch, Johnny Webb, testified Willingham confessed the arson murder to him.
But did he?
Webb later admitted it, unequivocally. He lied on the stand.
Why would he do that?
For a deal, a reduced sentence. A deal arranged with the prosecutor, John Jackson. The book says Jackson later actively helped make sure Webb got that deal.
Wow.
And when Webb was questioned about it later, he took the fifth repeatedly. Refused to answer on the grounds it might incriminate him.
So a witness admits lying for a deal helped along by the prosecution. And his testimony helped send a man to death row, possibly to his execution.
It just exposes how the system can create these really perverse incentives for people to lie, and how that adversarial nature can lead to hiding the truth instead of finding it.
It's incredibly tough hearing about these failures.
Wait.
But the book isn't only about injustice, is it? It also talks about perseverance.
That's such an important thread. The resilience of the people who were wrongly convicted and the crucial role of the advocates who fought for them.
Because getting relief is incredibly hard.
Immense obstacles. Appeals denied again and again. Convictions upheld even when the evidence just falls apart. Think about Joe Bryan denied parole multiple times. Perfect prison record. The state's own bloodstain expert recanted his testimony. Still denied.
The system really resists admitting mistakes.
It does. And the human cost is just devastating. The book mentions Derek Tice still having flashbacks years later, Carrie Max Cook's horrific time in prison, sexual assault, suicide attempts, the Savannah soldiers facing lasting health problems after 26 years locked up. These aren't just cases. They're shattered lives.
But there were people fighting back.
Yes, and the book really shines a light on them. People like Jim McCloskey, founding Centurion Ministries just to free innocent people, all the pro bono lawyers putting in thousands of hours, the Furbs helping the Norfolk Four, Don Brown and George Morris for Clarence Branley, Margaret Woodward, so many others.
They represent that persistent fight for truth.
Against overwhelming odds, yeah, just refusing to give up.
And journalism played a part, too, you mentioned.
Definitely. The book highlights investigative journalism, like David Grann's huge piece in The New Yorker on the Willingham case. That brought massive attention to the flawed arson science, forced reviews. It made a real difference.
So yeah, the stories are harrowing, but there's also this powerful counter-narrative in the book. Resilience, truth eventually coming out, often thanks to reliable science like DNA finally being used and dedicated people pushing for reform.
It shows justice isn't passive. It requires this active, often decades-long fight, an unwavering commitment.
So when you put it all together, what this book really shows us is that wrongful convictions, they aren't just random accidents. They come from this toxic mix of things.
Right. Bad hunches driving investigations, intense pressure for confessions, relying on shaky witnesses or snitches with deals, hiding evidence.
And especially maybe relying on forensic science that's questionable or just not properly understood.
It tells us that evidence that seems solid in court, presented with total authority, can just crumble when you look closer or when better science comes along.
Understanding how these things happen really drives home why critical thinking is so important. Questioning authority, pushing for really robust scientific standards and investigations in the courtroom.
Absolutely. And engaging with complex stuff like this, whether it's through conversations like ours or resources like the Mindful Moments on our YouTube channel or our podcasts using AI analysis, it helps build that deeper understanding. It encourages that reflection these issues really demand.
Yeah. You know, the book makes it incredibly clear that while DNA has freed a lot of people and shown us how big this problem is,
there are so many others, people convicted before DNA testing was even a thing, or in cases where DNA just isn't relevant.
So the final thought it leaves you with is, what does that tell us about the reliability of the evidence we still trust in all those other cases, the ones that haven't been re-examined with DNA's clarity?
It's a deeply sobering question. How many more out there?
If these stories made you stop and think, please subscribe so you don't miss our future conversations, unpacking complex topics.
And share this discussion with someone you know who cares about truth and justice.
You might also consider getting the book itself. We'll put a link in the show notes to really dive into these cases and others.
But most importantly, just keep thinking critically about the information you get and the systems around you.